So for this Halloween, I wanted to tackle my usual director ranking yet again. Though, who do I pick this time for the Halloween season? Well, decided to go a little out there with this choice. As for this October, I decided that I'm going to discuss the movies from none other than the legendary director, David Lynch. What can you say about David Lynch? No, seriously, what can you say about David Lynch? There's so much to discuss with this one man, but coming from someone who's been a fan of his work for quite some time, I can tell you one thing for certain.
There's an elephant in the room. I'd like you to start talking turkey.
I ordered coffee about a half hour ago.
He is one strange dude. As a person, David Lynch is certainly distinct, to say the least, as he has a very bizarre sense of humor and personality. The same goes with his art, as this man has directed some of the weirdest movies to have ever appear on film. Some say they have a lot of depth, others say they don't make any sense. Many wonder what David Lynch is saying in his films, yet I'm not even sure if he 100% understands his own work. That's how surreal his films can get. He certainly makes some really weird ass shit when it comes to his filmography. And I freaking love him for that. Whether you love or hate his movies, there's no denying that there is no one like David Lynch. He has made so many films that are, if nothing else, fascinating to say the least, as he makes movies like no other. He makes films that are very slow pace and very minimal dialogue, yet the execution of a lot of them make them extremely captivating. He's a talented director that can really set the mood for his films to a point where many would argue he's a good horror director. Which, yeah, this is a Halloween video after all. And while not every David Lynch movie is a horror film proper, he can often be a decent face for it. Many might debate on whether or not they can be fully categorized for it, but Lynch's style is so out there, they even have a name for it, called Lynchian. If that doesn't showcase the impact of this man's work, then nothing will. And that's exactly what I tend to honor today. I'm going to rank every single movie from David Lynch, as he's been one of my favorite directors for being such a unique mind and creating some really great stuff. We're going through the highs and lows, all the dark creepy moments to the weirdly hilarious and over the top ones. This video is dedicated to David Lynch's excellent lineup of work. Of course, this video will contain spoilers for some of these movies, so if there's one you hadn't seen yet and want to know as blindly as possible, just skip ahead to the various time codes in the video listed below. With that said and done, time to whip up a good cup of joe and head on to Twin Peaks, as these are the films of David Lynch, from worst to best.
Why did the Emperor choose this path? And who will our next oppressors be?
So, what's the worst movie of David Lynch's filmography? Well, I think this one is fairly obvious. As remember how this decade got us the awesomeness that is Dune Part 1 and 2? Well, guess what? David Lynch made a version that combines both of these two movies in the 80s. And quite frankly, this is not nearly as good as the movies from Denis Villeneuve. But is it bad enough to where it's worth calling the worst David Lynch movie?
I see many things. I see plans within plans.
Well, I can tell you that in comparison to the new films, it's certainly a hell of a lot weirder. Not surprising, this is strange coming from Lynch. However, this is the main time this director has worked on a major blockbuster studio film. In fact, prior to directing this movie, he was on set to direct Return of the Jedi. Yeah, imagine a fucking Star Wars movie directed by the guy who made Blue Velvet. His version of Frank Herbert's sci-fi novel is the closest thing we'll ever get to that, as it's his science fiction epic that failed hard with critics and audiences. This film does have a bit of a cult following, and while I do see the appeal of this in spite of the new films being infinitely better, I still don't think this is that good of a movie. Though, don't think I'm being too hard on this, despite being the lowest on the list, as I'm probably not nearly as harsh on this movie as the person who directed it. David Lynch himself has stated many times in the past that he hated the experience working on Dune was.
So it was a slow dying the death and a terrible, terrible experience.
Do you regret making it?
Yes.
This was stated as a very troublesome production, with him constantly butting heads with studio execs, to the point where the film ended up not being nearly as good as it could have been, which I can't really blame the guy. I mean, yeah, sour production can ruin an experience with any sort of film. Plus, it just goes to show how clueless execs are when handling an auteur like David Lynch. Yet despite the man's disdain for his own adaptation of Dune, this does serve as a fascinating film in David Lynch's career. It's really cool to see him tackle sci-fi, and unlike the Denis Villeneuve film, this does go a lot weirder, as it's filled with the typical strange David Lynch moments. Some of it comes across as unintentionally hilarious.
Oh yes, I forgot to tell you.
But like even some of the weakest 80s sci-fi movies of that time, there's a nice charm to it. There's still a lot of really cool effects and neat production design that does showcase the attempt at bringing this world to life. So it does kind of end up being a little bit fascinating at points. Where the movie ultimately doesn't work that well for me is that it's a very slow-paced film. Which, something to be clear, I've been accustomed to David Lynch's slow burn pacing in his films, so there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Where this movie backfires is that in his other films, they immerse you in this strange atmosphere that lets you soak in all the strange, crazy imagery you're witnessing in his movies. Dune doesn't do that. At least, not that well with immersion, as a lot of the film has a ton of slow-paced dialogue sequences. An exhibition-heavy plot that's not showcased in a way that's as captivating as it should be from someone like David Lynch. It's strange many would argue that the new Dune movies are also slow to a fault, but the reason why they work so much better is that Denis Villeneuve was able to have the freedom to create sequences, even simple dialogue ones, that make you feel like you're actually in this world, seeing this all firsthand. The film was shot in a way that really highlights the concept of Herbert's novel, in a visually stunning way for the most part. The Lynch version has way too many moments that feel static and uninteresting in terms of acting and placement. Take a look at how they introduced Duncan Idaho in the Lynch version versus how they do in the Villeneuve version.
Duncan!
Paul, I was just on my way to say goodbye to you. I have to go on ahead alone. I won't be seeing you for a while.
I wish you were coming with us. Why? Duncan.
A boy.
Hey.
Hey. Come, boy.
So you're going to Arrakis tomorrow? With the advanced team?
Yes, I'm going to Arrakis tomorrow with the advanced team.
Yeah, there's a lot more personality within the newer Dune, even within the exposition of that film. Lynch's version is even more so at fault, as it's not nearly as directed as well as we're used to from him. Even though I wouldn't really call this a good movie, I don't really dislike it or think that's unrecommendable. Like I said, this does have its fans, and I can see why, because it's an interesting attempt to adapt one of the most popular science fiction novels as a big film like this. To see someone as great as Lynch fail with this is such a fascinating failure, to say the least. But even as far as box office and critical failures of the 80s go, it still has an interesting production design and appeal that a lot of other B science fiction movies of the 80s had during that time too. It's a fascinating piece of work that is very much a product of its time, even to include a soundtrack by Toto. Yes. That Toto. but it kind of works in that cheesy sci-fi movie sort of way. The original source material does have some intrigue with how it handled its world and protagonist, being a different take on the hero's journey. It might have been told better in further adaptations after this one, but the surrealness does make the Lynch version stand out, even in the mix of other 80s science fiction movies. Plus, this also has one of the funniest end credits to a movie of this caliber ever. Like, this sitcom style end credits makes it so I can't really hate this movie if I'm being honest. This version of Dune does have enough of an identity to it to where I see it having a place in cinema history as a small cult movie. There's a lot of interesting factors that do make Dune stand out for better or for worse. As did you know that Dune was actually the first film to receive a PG-13 rating? Yeah, this came out the year Temple of Doom, Ghostbusters, and Gremlins essentially made it so PG-13 became a thing. So this was the first film to receive that rating. Who would have thought Lynch of all people would give us the first of its kind? Though on a much positive note, if there's one thing David Lynch said that was the best thing about working on Dune, is that this was his first time he got to work with Kyle MacLachlan. He had a positive enough experience with him on the production that he of course brought him back for so many other roles. So I can't hate Dune all that much, as if it wasn't for Dune, we probably wouldn't have gotten the legendary Dale Cooper.
I am the FBI.
If nothing else, this film does have Dale Cooper holding a pug, which is a positive note that isn't included in the newer films. But overall, I mostly recommend this movie if you're into these kind of strange 80s science fiction movies that aren't necessarily good but have a charm to them. It is neat for that reason. And I also recommend it if you are that curious to see how David Lynch would pull off sci-fi. However, if you're looking for the essential version of this story, I can't stress this enough. Just stick with the Denis Villeneuve version.
And is everybody in costume? Chimney sweep? Elephant Man?
David Lynch's second feature film, The Elephant Man, might be on the lower end of Lynch's filmography in my opinion, but it still comes highly recommended, especially as a film to introduce people to David Lynch, as it's not quite as surreal or as violent given the PG rating that his later films lack. But this film did get a lot of recognition when it came out, and for good reason, as it's a showcase of Lynch's talent as a director, without relying on his typical tropes. The movie is centered on the real-life story of Joseph Merrick, a deformed man who had been paraded around as part of a freak show in the late 1800s. We see Merrick go through all the struggles of his life in a story type we've seen numerous times before. The classic character who is rejected by society for his outward appearances, and we see their journey on becoming more accepted despite their looks. Despite Lynch at the helm directing, he doesn't go quite out there in comparison to his previous work. Not to say this movie doesn't have any of Lynch's signature things. It does have a pretty good sense of atmosphere, especially with the black and white cinematography. Plus, it does have a few experimental moments that do feel surreal, as this was his main way of actually incorporating actual elephants into the movie. Yet, this was the first of Lynch's work to get some significant award and critical recognition, including a Best Picture nomination. For good merit, as Lynch really emphasizes the raw emotion this story has. Merrick's story about being treated differently and how he's able to overcome those obstacles with the help of those who see the kind-hearted man he really is certainly one of the saddest of David Lynch's work. There's a decent amount of feels here, from witnessing moments like Merrick getting needlessly harassed, him trying to learn how to better himself, and even pleading to not be seen as a monster, as he just wants to live in peace. This is all very heartbreaking stuff. And I think what also sells it even further is the performance by John Hurt. It might be odd at first, considering how you don't really get to see a lot of the actor's emotion due to the heavy makeup attached to this character. Yet, Hurt makes it super convincing, as he really feels like an actual person with a disability, and we see those emotions still shine through. An excellent performance that also garnered him an Oscar nomination, and a well-deserved one too. Also gotta give props to Anthony Hopkins as well, whose really great as the main man who helps Merrick's situation. You can tell he's the main guy who empathizes with such a lonely man who wants to be accepted, and to see him genuinely be interested in assisting him is great to see. There's not really a lot to say about the Elephant Man. I just think there are plenty of Lynch films that are a bit more interesting. Not to say this doesn't have intrigue, especially with how good the performances and directing really is. But I do prefer the more out there and unique films of David Lynch that think outside the box, where this is a pretty straightforward biopic, though a very good one at that. It's one that still has an identity thanks to how good of a director David Lynch is. It's beautifully shot, has an incredible production design with the circus-like theming, and an incredible performance by John Hurt, bringing a lot of humanity to a character that many within the film couldn't quite see. If you want to watch a David Lynch film but nervous that his work might be too out there for you, then The Elephant Man is actually a pretty good starting point. It's a good film to watch, not just to be introduced to Lynch, but also to see the emotional story of not an animal, but a human being. So take that for what it's worth.
Hank! That crazy Canuck is mowing your yard!
So for the next film on this list, this is the one that has been stated by David Lynch himself to be his most experimental film to date. Yeah, for someone who makes a lot of out there stuff, this has to be saying something. To make things even more interesting, Lynch probably wouldn't have had this movie even be made if it wasn't for the help of the Walt Disney Company. No, I am serious. No, not kidding. This was actually distributed by Disney. Not only can you watch this on Disney Plus, but it even has the words "a David Lynch film" immediately after Walt Disney Pictures presents. So, what kind of film did the man who made Mulholland Drive decide to create as a family feature for Disney? Simple. A movie about an old man driving a lawnmower across the United States to visit his brother who he hasn't seen in years. What a fun old time, kiddies! Yeah, part of the reason why David Lynch considers The Straight Story to be his most experimental is mainly because this is not what you would expect from a David Lynch film in the slightest. This film, based on the real-life occurrence of Alvin Straight's journey across the Midwest, is, for lack of a better word, a very straightforward movie that's very mundane and doesn't have all the bizarre style we're used to from Lynch. Yet despite the fact that this is the only movie in David Lynch's filmography that's rated G, you know, the MPA rating that doesn't seem to exist now, I wouldn't call this a kid's movie, as this movie is only rated G because there's not really any violence or inappropriate stuff to be seen in this. I don't think this is a movie that your kid would be very interested in watching on Disney Plus when they can watch Big Hero 6 instead. It is a very slow-paced movie, which doesn't sound that uncommon because Lynch films are usually pretty slow, but you can feel the link more in this one with how mundane a lot of the stuff happens in the film. As for most of the movie is about Alvin Straight just driving his tractor, having conversation with random people he comes across, and then drives his tractor some more. And it's like this for nearly 2 hours. It's limited in dialogue and not really an eventful movie, so it's one that I can easily see some people shrugging off as, well, boring. Yet, how is it that I still end up really liking this movie and think it's actually worth your time if you're willing to check it out? Like, how can a concept like an old dude driving a lawnmower somehow manage to be not as boring as something like Solo: A Star Wars Story or James Cameron's Avatar? Well, despite how mundane it all is, there's really something captivating here, as David Lynch did essentially create a slice of life road movie. Alvin comes across random people on his journey, all having their own troubles and issues, but the way he sort of talks it out with these people ends up being really sweet to watch. Richard Farnsworth gives a very compelling and kind-hearted performance that makes a character that doesn't speak a whole lot and doesn't have a lot going for him more interesting to watch. You can tell within his eyes how much emotions he has been holding back, but still manages to be incredibly friendly and a bit insightful to everyone he comes across. It's a film that is all about experiencing the journey and all the little things you might come across during it. Yet, Lynch is a smart enough director to really make the message speak for itself, as he just shows you this journey and kinda lets you have a feel for it. It is especially apparent in the film's ending, which sums up the whole journey and why it was worthwhile to begin with so well. It ends with very minimal dialogue, and again, just lets you soak in that fact, which, for David Lynch, he really knows how to go at emotions in different ways than one might expect. It really does stand out super well as very distinct in Lynch's filmography, because of how much it deviates from his work. The fact he tried something so out there from his usual stick is commendable enough, and fortunately this film managed to succeed as one of his standout films that does work well on its own. Not to mention, it's not like there isn't any of Lynch's quirks, as the film does have occasionally funny moments that still feel like something out of his films. You get that weird sense of awkwardness that you see in a lot of attempts of humor in Lynch's films, like how characters would act and deliver lines in certain ways. It's not a lot, but still enough to be notable. Lynch, as a director, is amazing at atmosphere, and while this doesn't have the surreal visuals of his other movies, this still gives off a good sense of atmosphere. You really get a sense of you're really traveling across the USA with Alvin, with how well shot so much of it is, and edited fairly well too, even within its slow pace. I can't help but be a little immersed by what I'm seeing, despite a lot of it being typical American landscape. Overall, I think the straight story, in spite of its lack of Lynchian vibes, comes well recommended. I will always admire when a director does something completely unlike their previous work, and Lynch's attempt to go outside his comfort zone was quite a good one. At the moment, you can only really stream it on Disney+, but I'm hoping at some point there could be a Blu-ray. This is one of the few David Lynch films that doesn't have a Criterion release, and I think that should definitely change soon. Some might have said it was because of Disney, there might not have been a chance, but considering that WALL-E is now on the Criterion collection, I don't think there should be any excuse. David Lynch deserves all his movies to be on Criterion, damn it. Not much else to say. This straightforward story is more than worth your time to make the journey across the United States to witness an ambitious piece of filmmaking from Walt Disney Pictures and David Lynch.
Bunnies!
Now, there's a good chance you're watching this video and aren't familiar with David Lynch's filmography. You might be watching this video ranking knowing it's a Halloween video and wondering, where the hell is all the creepy shit? Like, I haven't really talked about a movie that's insanely creepy or weird. Isn't that what David Lynch is known for? Well, yes. But I think now we're finally getting into the kind of movies you would think of when you hear the name David Lynch. Inland Empire is the last feature film David Lynch directed, and with his unfortunate health situation, this might actually be his last feature film. Now, this movie is what, like 3 hours long? Surely there's going to be some weird, bizarre shit that's going to appear at some point in the last movie David Lynch directed. Yeah, this isn't the movie you should make as your first David Lynch film, if you're a newcomer. David Lynch went all out with, at the time, being his final motion picture with Inland Empire. A film that certainly is a lot to take in, as the film centers around a young actress named Nikki Grace. She's a part of this film shoot that goes horribly wrong and causes a lot of psychological trauma for her. And that's just putting things simply, because man, so much shit happens in this film, to the point where it might be inaccessible. I guess you could say this is a horror movie, and it does contain some incredibly effective moments that got me big time. Particularly a really creepy jump at the end that I dare not ruin for anyone who might have a little bit of an interest in this film. But fair warning, this does have a lot of things that you would expect from Lynch, and by that, I mean this has a mishmash of shit you wouldn't expect to be in any movie, let alone all together in one. I mean, in the mix of all the psychological trauma, uncomfortable close-ups, Terry Crews, a lot of uncomfortable sexual talk. The fucking rabbits. Oh, and did I mention that they also had some time in this movie to do the locomotion?
Everybody's doing a brand new dance now. Come on, baby.
What the?
Yeah, this movie is insane, but I feel like it's quite intentional, as this is still a fascinating movie from beginning to end. I think it because of how gradually it becomes crazier, and you see more of the destructive nature this character is going through within these events. It's clear that David Lynch is trying to make the audience feel the same amount of insanity the main character is facing. If you see it that way, this movie ends up being very unique and a memorable experience. I think partially what sells it is Laura Dern's performance, as she's excellent in this, balancing so many different emotions throughout the entire film. She commits to every frame, and I think her having such a good relationship with David Lynch really proves that worked here. You're in this journey with her, from humble beginnings where she deals with Jeremy Irons, to this insane clusterfuck of dark shit that appears in the final moments of the film. An ambitious yet memorable piece of work. But the biggest fault I find when it comes to Lynch's work, this was the kind of movie that was actually done better in the last movie David Lynch directed. Given that this film is also about an actress dealing with a dark side of Hollywood, there's a lot of parallels, and it does feel like Lynch is repeating himself somewhat. Not to an extreme degree, but the other film in question will definitely be talked about later. I can't help but feel that movie did a better job with its experience as a film. Even if Lynch does try to out-Lynch himself in every moment of this movie. And it does succeed in a lot of ways. As a whole, I do recommend Inland Empire quite a bit, but mostly for the ones who are heavily familiar with Lynch's filmography. This is not a movie for newcomers, like I said, because it goes so out there and extreme. But those who are willing to put up with some form of insanity like this will find a very fascinating, disturbing, and creative nightmare that only Lynch can provide. He's one of a kind, and this movie represents a lot of that big time. Oh yeah, and you're probably wondering about the rabbits. I say watch the movie to get your own interpretation of this shit.
Think to yourself, there's no place like home. There's no place like home.
There's no place like home.
So, prior to writing this script for this video in particular, I had seen every single David Lynch movie at least once, with the sole exception of one movie. Oh, and the reason I hadn't watched it is not because I was disinterested in this movie, quite the contrary. The reason I hadn't watched this movie yet is mainly because of a different issue entirely. An issue dealing with the age of streaming services. Yeah, the idea of streaming sounds very promising when it first became a thing. Being able to watch a movie at the click of a button without having to leave your home, all through a monthly service? That sounds like the perfect deal, right? Well, as we have seen in recent memory, streaming has gotten movies into a lot more problems, with so many of them now, and all of them being very inconsistent on what kind of stuff is on there. One of the common problems is certain movies and shows constantly being swapped around different services to the point where you can't watch certain movies at the click of a button. Like, for example, let's say I'm in the mood to watch The Big Lebowski, and I got Netflix to watch it, because I remember it was on Netflix for a while, only to go to the site and see that it's not on there anymore. This is due to licensing between studios and certain streaming services having access to a certain movie at a time. So either you just happen to have the other streaming service that Big Lebowski is on, or, even worst case scenario, you just have to flat out buy or rent the movie because it's not on a service you own at the moment. Where this next David Lynch movie falls under the problem is slightly worse, because this movie in particular is not available to stream anywhere. Not Netflix, not HBO Max, not Peacock. You can't even watch this movie on Oaxis from Butch Hartman. There's not a single streaming service that has this film. To make matters worse, you can't even rent it on Apple TV or Amazon for like $5. So this movie is kind of hard to find. So in order for me to make this video and to be fully dedicated to it, I just said fuck it and just bought the Blu-ray for the movie. And that movie in question is Wild at Heart. Now, it's a crime that this movie isn't available on any service at the time I'm making this video, as I've been eager to watch it. It's not even just simply because it's a David Lynch film either. I mean, obviously it's one of the main reasons, but it's not the only reason. Oh no, this is a David Lynch film starring Willem Dafoe and the king of over-the-top acting insanity, Nicolas Cage. Now, you have these three people involved in one movie. Doesn't matter what the hell the movie is. Just knowing that these guys who are bizarre and insane in their own right, you know a movie involving these three talents is going to be something to behold. And at the very least, be interesting. So does Wild at Heart live up to that potential hype?
Okay. Why don't you step up here, hotshot? I'll slap that smile right off your face.
I say more or less yes. Wild at Heart is a movie that delivers on its title, as this is one crazy movie that's certainly a solid candidate for good first Lynch movie. The film has one of the more simpler plots of a David Lynch film, being about two star-crossed lovers, Sailor Ripley and Lula Fortune, played by Nicolas Cage and Laura Dern. They're on a big road trip cross-country to rebel against their parents, in a movie filled with all sorts of crazy weirdness, and also some rather extreme moments as well. You get some surrealness, with Lynch essentially giving Nicolas Cage the opportunity to play Elvis in a movie.
Please love me.
Yet you also get some extreme violence in the mix, as this movie gets pretty brutal at points. The first 5 minutes alone gives you an idea of how extreme this movie can get, and it tends to have that extreme energy throughout. A lot of great music, and out of all the films in his filmography, this film is easily the horniest. Like, seriously, there is so much sex and nudity that appears throughout this movie. I definitely wouldn't recommend this movie to anyone who hates seeing sex in any capacity in movies. But all the horniness is forgiven when you consider that at the end of the day, this is a love story. At many parts, this film is kind of a parody of those romantic style films of the 50s, and sort of has a fun play on them. Though again, it's not without its surrealness, as this movie filled with so much sex and violence also has a ton of callbacks to The Wizard of Oz. This makes much more sense if you know that David Lynch's favorite movie is actually The Wizard of Oz. But of course, can't forget the main appeal of this movie, which is the film's iconic star. Nicolas Cage is an actor you definitely would want to see work with a director like David Lynch. He omits this badass energy that's oddly hilarious in Nicolas Cage's awkward way. He's as over the top you would expect, along with him having a sick snake jacket, man. To the slight disappointment, however, Willem Dafoe doesn't quite appear in this as much as you would have hoped, as he doesn't come in until around the third act. But when he does, it's still glorious. He plays the ever so slimy Bobby Peru, who's such a dick and is unapologetic about it as one would expect Willem Dafoe could do as an awesome bad guy. But again, he doesn't appear in the movie a whole lot, even if his exit is unforgettable. But I don't want to get too ahead of myself here. You may see a lack of Nick and Willem acting off one another, but when you do, it's still fun to see. Plus, that's not to say that the other stars in this slack too. Laura Dern also does an excellent job as Lula, being a character who clearly has a rough past, but wants to be open to her more wild side. Diane Ladd plays Lula's mother, and she commits a lot of presence in her time, being very intense, but also vibing well with the film's strange tone. She even got an Oscar nomination for this role, so it's clear that David Lynch is good with actors. It even has a bunch of actors Lynch worked with quite a bit in the past, including Audrey Horne of Twin Peaks. That's cool to see Sherilyn Flynn here before her big debut. This film is quite an experience to say the least, and should get more recognition. People need to see this really unique take on a cross-lover road trip from such a great director like David Lynch. Hopefully this will get more available in the future. I mean, it won the Palme d'Or for crying out loud at Cannes. So how is this film widely not more available? Regardless, if you could sneak out a copy of this movie in some way, definitely do so, as this film is worth going on the road in a ride crazy enough to combine Lynch, Dafoe, and Cage. But if that didn't sell you on this from the beginning, then I don't know what will.
She wore blue velvet.
Where do I even begin with a movie like Blue Velvet? Certainly one of the most recognizable David Lynch films out there. Just look how peaceful this all is. Such a happy, joyful film. Of course it doesn't last long. It's David Lynch after all. We got some weird shit to deal with. However, despite this film being very much essential to David Lynch, with so much of what makes his filmography stands out, all encapsulated here, I would say this is one of the less strange Lynch films. Not without its odd moments, but I say despite some of the themes tackled in this movie being uncomfortable for some viewers, this actually is one of the more accessible David Lynch films. The film is about a young man named Jeffrey Beaumont, who's trying to figure out a series of strange events happening involving a murderer, as this ends up being a noir film, with so much mystery, murder, and even a femme fatale named Dorothy Vallis, a woman who Jeffrey encounters a lot throughout this film, and starts having a thing for her after suspecting she might be part of the murderers. Though shit, a lot more happens in this movie, as there's a whole subplot with Jeffrey getting in a relationship with Sandy, in the mix of falling in love with the other leading lady of this film, Dorothy having her own checkered past with her suffering from abuse, and even has to deal with an abusive partner played by the one and only Dennis Hopper. This has a lot to it, but it ends up being a very fascinating movie from beginning to end. It's mostly due to, in part, to one thing: David Lynch himself. This is an incredibly well-directed movie that's very well shot, edited, and just has the perfect use of colors. That's not even just including blue as the title implies. It's directing so good that the film's only Oscar nomination was for Best Director, which, partial bummer nothing else got recognized, but still, your film being nominated for Best Director is nothing to scoff at. Shows how excellent of a director David Lynch is. I say it's mostly because Lynch knows how to set the mood very well, as this film goes through a lot of different emotion. It's at one moment's nice, another moment's very dark and sinister, and then maybe it goes to something kind of funny, in the mix of the other weird parts, like this.
In dreams, I walk with you.
Yet David Lynch makes this movie work since he knows when to do it at the exact right moment, to where it feels appropriate. It's hard to exactly pinpoint why, but it's something that if you're into these kind of films, you notice. Mostly if you're familiar with Lynch's technique of showcasing something rather peaceful on the surface, having a bit of a dark underbelly when the film goes on. It's an engaging mystery from the start, and also has a lot of interesting things that makes it an enticing watch. This movie is quintessential Lynch, as this has a lot of the same sort of appeal that something like Twin Peaks had. And I'm not just saying that because Kyle MacLachlan plays the lead in this. It just has the same sort of vibe of being an engaging mystery, having some interesting romances, quirky and bizarre characters, and really weird moments that make it unforgettable. It's all enhanced even further with a really good soundtrack and some great performances all around. As David Lynch stated, the best part of Dune was getting to meet Kyle MacLachlan, and he's great in this. While Jeffrey Beaumont is no Dale Cooper, he's a decent precursor to him, and MacLachlan commands a good presence throughout. Everyone else from Laura Dern to Isabel Rossellini do a great job in this film. Though the real star of the show, if you ask me, is quintessential 80s and 90s movie villain bad guy, and the only actor in my opinion who could have played Donald Trump in a movie, Dennis fucking Hopper.
Shut up!
He's insane in this. Just this maniacally evil person who's just every bit as bad as you want Dennis Hopper to be in a movie. Maybe too bad considering what he does in this, but you can't deny he's certainly giving it his all in being this crazy person who just loves to spew out F-bombs like no other.
Don't you fucking look at me. Who is this fuck?
Get your fucking robe!
Let's drink to fucking.
Let's hit the fucking road! Fuck that shit!
It's an iconic role, and definitely my personal favorite performance from Dennis Hopper. Overall, if you haven't seen Blue Velvet, it's worth seeing. Comes highly recommended. And maybe if you're interested in David Lynch but not sure if his weird style would suit you, this is a good starting point. It doesn't go crazy out there in the vein of a lot of Lynch's later work, but it still has the intrigue and great direction that makes him one of the great directors in my opinion. It's funny, heartbreaking, and strange all at once. The exact kind of movie I would expect from a mind like David Lynch. And possibly the most iconic performance from Dennis Hopper of all time. And the Super Mario Brothers movie, of course.
Do you know what I love about mud?
Yeah, I'm honestly glad I associate Dennis Hopper with these two the most. Let's face it, for as good as Jack Black was as Bowser, it would have been really fun to hear Hopper again if he was still around. His Bowser would still work in animation for him, as long as you give him the same vocabulary you gave him in Blue Velvet.
What kind of beer do you like? Heineken? Fuck that shit! Pabst Blue Ribbon!
So with this being a David Lynch video, I couldn't really make this video complete without talking a bit about the thing David Lynch is known for the most. I mentioned already in this video in passing, Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks is legitimately one of the best things to ever appear on television in my opinion. This is one experience of a show to witness, as it's about an FBI agent trying to solve the mystery of the murder of Laura Palmer in the town of Twin Peaks. It grabs you in by being an intriguing mystery with a distinct cast of characters, and then just eventually unravels into the ultimate David Lynch experience. It has a bit of everything: surreal visuals, awkward yet humorous moments, distinct filmmaking techniques, and just about anything that made David Lynch the household name among cinephiles he is today. And it's not on the list!
Fucking A, man. It drives me nuts.
Now, despite this being the most popular thing David Lynch has ever done, there's a perfectly good explanation to why I'm not including Twin Peaks on this list. It's a show, not a movie. Yeah, this is the films of David Lynch rank. I don't think it would make a lot of sense to put an entire TV show on a list discussing a director's filmography. Sure, some episodes of Twin Peaks run about as long as a movie, but they're still just a part of one big overarching TV series. I know technically speaking, Twin Peaks: The Return is sometimes classified as a movie due to it being labeled as a miniseries and is even able to rate on Letterboxd. However, let's not kid ourselves here. This really was just the final season of Twin Peaks. So again, not a movie here. This is the simple reason why I'm not including Twin Peaks on this list. Oh, this doesn't mean I'm not going to recommend that you watch this show. By all means, this series is a must-watch for anyone, really. Plus, don't think I just decided to bring this series up in a video for the sake of it, because there is one thing related to this series that I can talk about in a video about the films of David Lynch.
Through the darkness of future past, the magician longs to see one chance out between two worlds. Fire, walk with me.
Twin Peaks actually did get a movie back in 1992, shortly after the series ended, with Fire, Walk With Me. Now, this film was incredibly divided when it came out. Not surprising considering how divisive some of Lynch's films are, but in the case of Fire, Walk With Me, there was a particular reason why people weren't crazy about this movie. Not just because it's a movie based on a TV show that only caters to fans. In fact, it's the fans who were the one that hated this movie at first. This is because, due to a lot of production issues, and studio meddling, Twin Peaks' time on the air ran very short, lasting only 2 seasons. And to make matters worse, without spoiling anything, the series ended on a massive cliffhanger. So now fans were finally able to get the answers to the questions left off in the final episodes with this film, right? Actually, no, because the film we got instead was a prequel. This was pretty upsetting to a lot of fans, not just because of the lack of answers given regarding where the series ended off, but also because some would argue a prequel is pointless, as the film is about the final days of Laura Palmer before her untimely death, which some could see it as unnecessary since, well, we already know the outcome of the story. We know what's going to happen to Laura Palmer, and we already know how it's going to happen to begin with on a basic level. So why have a prequel movie showcasing more of what happens before the series began when the movie could have finished off the original series properly? Well, some point to the reason why this film was made to the element and arguably star of Twin Peaks.
Diane, 11:30 a.m., February 24th. Entering the town of Twin Peaks.
No, not him. We'll get to his contribution in a bit. I'm more so referring to her. It's been cited that David Lynch is a big fan of the Laura Palmer character, and wanted the way for her story to be showcased fully. We might know what exactly happened to her at this point, seeing the whole series, but we don't get a sense of how we feel about it. This show really gives us that feel, as Lynch strives more on emotion with the filmmaking in this film. Twin Peaks has a good amount of that throughout, but this film really goes in on being a very dreamlike experience, and possibly some of the darkest imagery we've seen in the entire series. It's especially apparent in the film's ending, which again, we might know what has already happened, but actually seeing it unfold, this ending goes hard. A downright nightmarish experience, all conveyed with Lynch's excellent direction, and Cheryl Lee being pretty incredible as Laura Palmer. She always was, but here now that we see more of her, we get more attached to Laura ever than we did before, making the fate she ends up in all the more tragic. This film is essential to the Twin Peaks experience, as it also does tie into the eventual 3rd season as well. Though, even outside of Twin Peaks, this is an incredibly well put together noir thriller that's intense and every bit as David Lynch as you would like it to be. However, it's hard to recommend this movie without watching the show first. I know that might sound strange considering this is a prequel, but the film is meant to be something to watch more with the show in mind. For one, spoilers galore for the series itself if you haven't watched it, as watching this prior to the show, all the major mysteries that occur are pretty much revealed right away. There's not that sense of mystery you get watching the show if you had seen the movie prior to it, which is an essential appeal. This is more Pinnacle Twin Peaks, as something after watching the initial run of the series, as it's made to be more appreciated with the show in mind. That, and this doesn't quite have everything that made the original Twin Peaks so appealing, as this movie is a lot darker than the average Twin Peaks episode, which might have its dark moments at points. It also had its moments of humor and quirkiness that made it also a very entertaining show.
Harry?
This is not reflective of that kind of weird sense of humor Lynch can be known for, which might be unappealing if that's something you enjoyed about Twin Peaks. I think mostly it has to do with the fact that a lot of the characters in this show don't appear in this. You know, all the weird, humorous, and fun characters like Audrey, Lucy, Andy, Pete, and some of the other memorable characters that made the show quite unique. You get some here, like James, of course. The Log Lady has a brief cameo appearance too, and you do get Donna here, except she's not played by Laura Flynn Boyle, and instead played by the same girl who was Nala on The Lion King. Though most notably, the film had the major appearance of the biggest star of Twin Peaks, Mr. Dale Cooper. That was another part that made fans massively disappointed in the movie, as everyone's favorite FBI agent, the character that many say makes the series so good, doesn't really have a lot to do here. Oh, he's in this movie, but his screen time is accumulated to probably about 10 minutes. Not a lot for him to do, which made many very upset at the time. Yet I don't feel like that was necessarily the point, as much as I love Dale Cooper as much as the next guy. This was more about Laura Palmer's story. We have a whole series dedicated to Dale Cooper, so I think his lack of screen time here isn't that horribly missed. If anything, we at least have season 3 where we can see him there, only now to be incredibly depressed. To make things even more strange, the first 30 minutes of this film, despite being the style of Twin Peaks, focuses on a different character who's like Dale Cooper, except not Dale Cooper. It focuses on a different FBI agent named Chester Desmond, as this movie does a reverse of how Metal Gear Solid 2 handled its lead, which I'm not going to explain what I meant by that, as if you played Metal Gear Solid 2, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Yet, it's the kind of out-of-the-box thinking is what makes me love David Lynch, and he even makes up for it by bringing the Goblin King himself, David Bowie, to be in the mix of this.
Who do you think this is there?
So, how can you hate a guy like David Lynch? So overall, Fire Walk With Me is an excellent companion to one of David Lynch's biggest achievements as a creative artist. Though again, doesn't come as highly recommended without watching the series it's based on, which that should not be surprising in the slightest, as I don't think I need to recommend this movie to Lynch fans, because chances are you have most definitely seen Twin Peaks at this point. If you're someone who hasn't watched Twin Peaks at any point, Lynch fan or not, it's totally worth taking that trip, like I said. It's a perfect summation of David Lynch as the distinct creative mind he is, taking a simple murder mystery with a soap opera style into something grander than anything we could have initially imagined. Fire Walk With Me cements Twin Peaks' status as an iconic show, even further, as a dreamlike experience unlike no other. So take that for what it's worth. And if you're still not satisfied with this movie, don't worry. Just remember what Laura Palmer said regarding the eventual true ending of Twin Peaks.
I'll see you again in 25 years.
Funny how secrets travel on. I start to believe if I were to bleed, in sky the man shakes his hands held high.
Certainly one of the more underrated films in his filmography, Lost Highway is certainly a trip of a movie that's every bit as Lynchian and ambitious as you would expect. To discuss the plot as vaguely as I can, this is about a man trying to uncover a mystery between the woman he loves and the threat she might have faced. The direction it goes is completely unpredictable, as this mix of horror and noir really takes a different direction in the second half, focusing even on something that wasn't established at all prior to the film. I will admit, it might take a few watches for this to really settle in on what actually is going on, but at the end of the film, it's heavily implied all of this is connected together in more ways than one. It's a pretty fascinating movie that's dark and disturbing, yet super ambitious with its storytelling. Lynch's directing is at some of its best, with some great use of camera work, colors, and lighting, giving this film the ultimate mood. A lot of great performances too, with Bill Pullman playing a mean sax, and Patricia Arquette being a really good femme fatale in this. It even has Superman 3 star Richard Pryor, along with the ever so insane and crazy Gary Busey, and
whoa, Robert Loggia!
Billy!
This movie is certainly a move. I first saw this in 35mm at the indie movie theater I went to back in college, and it certainly makes for a good creepy ass movie. This is a Halloween video after all, so I gotta talk more about the spooky things that appear in Lynch's films. One of them being possibly his most disturbing character creation.
We've met before, haven't we?
The Mystery Man is certainly one of the creepiest characters I've seen in a Lynch film. His whole look with that unsettling smile and spine-curling laugh just gets under the skin so harshly. The fact that he appears so limitedly throughout the film and always has something rather sinister to say makes his appearances all the more impactful. Oh, And one last thing to mention, easily the best soundtrack of a David Lynch film in my opinion. The opening credits set to David Bowie's I'm Deranged sets up this movie so perfectly, and it's the antithesis to why this soundtrack works so well for this movie. If you haven't seen Lost Highway, and you're the kind of person who finds a David Lynch film appealing, I certainly say check this one out. It's starting to get more and more recognition, especially with the recent Criterion 4K Blu-ray release. In fact, nearly most of David Lynch's films are on Criterion, except for Straight Story, Wild at Heart, and Dune, but maybe someday. At least for Straight Story, since that doesn't have a Blu-ray at all. Either way, they're worth checking out, especially if you're a fan of physical media. Lost Highway is quite an underrated masterpiece that I think is a neat thinking outside the box film that Lynch loves to give out. Tense, captivating, and all around metal. This is one highway certainly worth getting lost in.
6980 Mulholland Drive. Mulholland Drive.
If there's any film that many have claimed to be David Lynch's magnum opus, it might just be Mulholland Drive. For good reason, as believe it or not, this was the first ever film I watched from David Lynch. And boy, let me tell ya, this was one hell of an introduction. To a strong extent, I didn't know how to feel about this movie first watching it. There were parts I didn't quite understand, parts I didn't quite get into, yet there were also so many parts where I was oddly entranced and intrigued by such a strange feature that if nothing else, it's unforgettable. The film centers around a young aspiring actress named Betty, who moves to Los Angeles to become a star. However, things take a sudden turn as she rounds up meeting another young woman with amnesia known as Rita. She promises to help Rita figure out the mystery of her past and how she ended up in Mulholland Drive. That's just the basic premise, as there is so much to unpack with this film, as despite it seemingly being atypical noir, this goes to many strange and unusual places. Even the story ends up being rather complex and maybe even hard to follow, as first time watching this, it took a while for me to really get the vibe of this movie, and whether or not it was something that I liked. It's almost a slow burn, but as it goes on, it has a weirdness that's simply unmatched, as Lynch ends up combining a lot of different genres of drama, horror, and even comedy in this grand 2.5 hour film. It's filled with moments that are very disturbing, but Lynch's filmmaking style really gets you sucked into this to where by the third act, it goes kind of off the walls, being even more complicated with a bit of a sudden twist that leads to an ending that, first time watching this, I couldn't figure out if I was supposed to laugh, cry, or be utterly mortified by what I had just saw on screen. Considering this is David Lynch, I'm pretty sure it was supposed to be all three. This is a film with so many emotions, filled with so many strange, out there things. It has overly upbeat musical numbers, sad operas, rotting corpses, a lady that looks like Marge Simpson, Hannah Montana's dad, a philosophical cowboy. I expect no less than a David Lynch film.
So since you agree, you must be a person who does not care about the good life.
And, not to mention, some really effective use of horror, as this film does have one scene that I had always loved and really want to discuss. Fair warning though, this does contain spoilers, and while maybe not seemingly too affected by the film's story in the grand scheme of things, or is it? I feel like this movie is better experience not knowing a whole lot going in. Not only that, but this scene I am about to show does contain a jump scare. So if any of that bothers you, just skip it this time frame. Anyway, the scene in question is, of course, the diner scene. Watching this movie late at night definitely didn't help me get spooked by this moment, as it starts out with a conversation between two dudes, and one of them is talking about a dream they had. They had a nightmare where they were in this diner and they saw a horrible figure that traumatized them within the dream. It has an interesting build-up, already giving a creepy vibe, but things get a little worse when they leave the diner, and the man telling the story starts to feel unnerved. You kind of feel something too, but it can't be that bad, right? I mean, this is in the daytime. Nothing scary happens in horror movies during the daytime. Well, this movie certainly changed that with this heart-jumping moment. Yeah, that got me big time. And it's such an effective horror moment to the point where I'm kind of in agreement to consider David Lynch films as horror movies. Well, albeit very out there and strange horror movies, but horror films nonetheless. This moment right here was proof that David Lynch can do an incredibly scary moment. The way it builds up and the sudden reveal to what it is can't help but shook you a bit. It's certainly a scene that I love seeing people's reaction to when they see it for the first time.
Whoa! Well, it scared the shit out of me.
Whoa! Is that fucking blackface, dude?
Either way, despite how weird it can be, despite how it dives into some uncomfortable topics, for anyone who is willing to, this movie comes highly recommended. This is because this is essential David Lynch giving you a good idea of what kind of films he makes. With a movie that could make you laugh, cry, and also be terrified in a way that, let's face it, feels like no other movie in the grand scheme of things. It's also worth noting, much like many of the other great films from David Lynch, it's also shot beautifully, edited so well, and also some really incredible acting, especially by Naomi Watts, who gives it her all in this throughout every scene in the film. Watching Mulholland Drive for the first time was an unforgettable experience. And while I personally think for many less experienced viewers, Blue Velvet is a better movie to be introduced to the work of Lynch, considering this was my first, and how much me and other people claim this film to be a masterpiece, it's not a bad one to be the first. Just know that you're going to be in for a one-of-a-kind experience. But you don't have to necessarily take my word for it. Hopefully, if nothing else convinces you, maybe you can take a word from one of David Lynch's biggest critics of all time. Roger Ebert, probably the most famous movie critic you know, well, most famous one that didn't originate from YouTube at least, was notorious for not liking the films of David Lynch at all. He found them to be pretentious, and even accused Lynch of sexism for his portrayal of how women were treated on film.
Sure, the movie's well made, but the more I thought about it, the less I liked it.
Yet, this is what he had to say about Mulholland Drive.
As I watched this film, I was completely fascinated by it and drawn into it and entertained by it and absorbed by it from beginning to end. I don't care what its source was, whether it was made for TV or whether it was made for David Lynch's home movies, it works.
That's right. Even David Lynch's biggest hater said this movie was awesome. That's certainly saying something.
How you doing, Roger?
That's how good of a movie Mulholland Drive is. Whether this be your first David Lynch film or not. If there's any movie that I say is a definite must-see if you have any sort of interest in David Lynch, it's definitely this one. Mulholland Drive is a one-of-a-kind experience that has to be seen to be believed. It's ambitious, funny, touching, heartbreaking, horrifying, and so many other things all at once. If you want something different for the Halloween season, I say it's worth taking that trip down Mulholland Drive to see what it's all about. If there's any movie that I think earns the #1 spot on this list, it's the movie that made David Lynch the director he is today. Eraserhead was his first feature film, and even after everything else he has made, I can't help but think that he never quite topped himself after this unique experience of a film. Eraserhead is a quintessential art house horror that's abstract, surreal, and very out there, but certainly one of a kind. The film is about a young man who's dealing with a lot of major anxieties about experiencing fatherhood. That's basically the gist of the plot. as this movie is certainly more abstract than what your typical audience member would usually gravitate towards. This is a film that's very slow paced, and not a whole lot of dialogue is stated in this film. Yet, I can't help but be entranced by the whole thing. Mainly because one thing that David Lynch is good at, that's also something that I tend to love to see horror movies excel at.
Atmosphere!
The atmosphere in this film is incredible. It just sets an unsettling vibe throughout the entire runtime. The sets are fascinating, the makeup is disturbing and effective, and the black and white cinematography really gives this movie a mood like no other. It's strange to think that a simple plot of a man becoming a dad for the first time, you wouldn't think that would be executed that creepy. Well, in this film, they make it so. Especially when the kid this man has to raise is this fucking thing. This is the Eraserhead baby. It's such a strange looking creature that does nothing but makes these unsettling noises while the lead has to take care of him. And sometimes not always in the most effective ways.
Sick.
It's so weird, you can't help but either laugh uncomfortably or just be disturbed by this strange creature that's a representation of all the lead's fears into one of the most grotesque looking creatures. It's like a strange horse E.T. fetus looking thing, and the film is filled with so much more strange moments. More moments that do make this a legit horror movie, with how it really gives this sense of dread throughout its short runtime. It's a breeze of a movie if you can be open to a more slow pace and art house style of filmmaking. Yet even with how creepy it is, it's strangely also kind of a comedy at points, even during its more horrifying scenes. All leading up to an ending that's incredibly brutal and could lead to a lot of confusion. It's with all of this consideration is why Eraserhead had the impact that it had on me. This and Mulholland Drive being my introduction to that proves that these movies can have an appeal, even if the average moviegoer might not understand them. The appeal that movies can be more than just entertainment, as they're very much art in a way. Lynch's filmography is proof of that. After all, the man started out as a painter who was creating art to express himself. Eraserhead was him doing that on a grander scale, and I think he succeeds with that. David Lynch is proof that even if you can find a movie a little bit not your thing, even if you don't understand it or what the filmmaker was trying to do, and even if you outright did not enjoy the experience, there's no denying what you're witnessing is art. David Lynch is an artist like no other in the world of cinema. And it's creative minds like him is what I always love from the art form of film. It's a sense of self-expression someone can put in a way no one else can. And David Lynch understands that throughout his entire career, creating films that are heartbreaking, horrifying, humorous, and just plain weird. He created films that are one of a kind. Eraserhead is the perfect antithesis of what a filmmaker can do to transcend and become a full-blown artist. So take that for what it's worth. And that's it for my David Lynch ranking, you guys. I hope you folks have a good Halloween season, and I can't think of anything else I could do that would be a good way to close out such a weird topic like this. So I decided to get some help here. As for this video, I am bringing on a special guest that will help me get out some poignant words to close off such an interesting topic. And that guest is none other than David Lynch himself. Well, don't you have anything to say?
No.
Really? Are you sure? No very unique advice for our fellow audience?
No.
Oh, come on, David Lynch. I made a video just talking about how awesome you are. Clearly, you should get back the favor by giving me some good word of advice for me and the audience.
All right, get over here. Now remember this. When the horizon's at the bottom, it's interesting. When the horizon's at the top, it's interesting. When the horizon's in the middle, it's boring as shit. Now, good luck to you.
Wow, that's actually some really great advice. Thank you, Mr. Lynch, and for all your incredible movies.
My pleasure.